I read your book. I thought that was important for this interview. And in the book, you mention a fairly dramatic moment when you're with your former boss, Manny Ravelis at Preston Ellis, and you say that he warned you that you would either wind up dead, disgraced, or in jail. At the moment that he said, not reflecting backwards, but the moment that he said it, what went through your mind?
Well, his comment regarded a client that we had. It wasn't about me necessarily. It was about really an effort that we were engaged in. We were lobbyists, and lobbying is basically a series of political fights on Capitol Hill primarily, sometimes in the administration. And we were engaged in a very brutal fight on behalf of a client called the Northern Marianas Islands. And this fight, sometimes lawyers represent clients that aren't necessarily the most savory folks, but they may not be guilty, or they may be guilty, but lawyers are there to represent them. And lobbyists represent clients that aren't always beloved. In fact, frankly, if they were always beloved, they wouldn't need lobbyists. Then my old occupation wouldn't have much to do. But this particular client was attacked continually in the media. And we felt, after examining the client on the ground, not just me, but members of the firm who are expert in labor law and things like that, that the client was unfairly attacked. And so we were aggressive. Once we got the sign-off, we were aggressive to defend that client. And in the course of doing so, I, at the behest of the client, composed a strategy memorandum that laid out the strategies that I was going to employ. And I was a very rough lobbyist. I was a very tough lobbyist. And when my clients' interests were at stake, I didn't hold back. I basically would attack, or I would have my up to 40 lobbyists who work for me vigorously pursue those who were putting them in rough waters. That's not a normal approach by a lot of lobbyists, believe it or not. Most of them actually will tepidly represent their clients' interests, almost temerariously. And at times they'll win, and at times they'll lose. We had an attitude, and this is in fact, unfortunately, part of the ethos, I think, that ultimately was a problem and brought me down, that we wanted our clients to always win. And indeed, we, unfortunately, for better or for worse, usually won. Now, in this case, this memorandum was given dutifully to the client, and the client was so impressed with the memorandum that they decided to show it to the local media on the island to brag as to how much we were doing. Well, it wasn't too long before this made it into the Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post, Seattle Times, where the firm was based. And the firm wasn't used to this kind of hijinks, so they basically were very upset. My approach was, I'm sorry that happened, and certainly I'm certainly as chagrined as anyone that my strategies were now public and that we were being lambasted as these aggressive killers, but this is what the client hired us to do. I entered the office of the managing partner, who was or the senior partner of the firm, Manny Ravelis, as you mentioned, who said he was very upset. He didn't like when lobbying got into the newspapers. Most lobbyists, by the way, don't like it when lobbying gets in the newspapers. It's not exactly it's kind of like making sausages. You don't want people to come see what you're doing. You just want them to get the sausage, preferably in a bun. And so he sat me down and he let me have it. And at the end, he said, you know, at the rate you're going with these clients, you'll either be disgraced, imprisoned, or dead within 5 years. In jail. And I said I was upset by that comment. It turns out he was prescient. He was off on timing, but he was prescient that indeed that's what the course, unfortunately, my career led to.
But where your head was at that moment, you rejected it?
No, I rejected it, and I was resentful. I was part of I had an overall resentment to the firm's attitude toward my clients. My clients were Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, Africans, and they weren't the normal sort of mix of lobbying clients. In the lobbying world, the coin of the realm is to get Fortune 500 companies because they're safe, long-term clients. And I, frankly, thought they were boring. I thought corporations were boring. They normally wanted you to do research, and I wasn't the best researcher. We were warriors, and so I would only really take on a corporate client if it was in a situation where they were in a life and death fight, like Tyco and others that we represented. And so I resented the notion that somehow these clients weren't good enough for the firm. At times it was put even in more racial terms to me, that I needed to get Fortune 500 people, people like us. Well, us did not include Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Africans. It included corporate types. So I got a little resentful toward that.
Right, but one of the things that came out in the emails, and I don't know whether this was just locker room talk, but the characterizing some of the clients as morons or troglodytes.
Right. I'm glad you raised that. It is without a doubt. I am the poster child for don't write in the email what you don't want to read on the front page of the paper. Over the course of time that I was a lobbyist, roughly just under 10 years, I wrote 850,000 emails and sent them. And by the way, the reaction in the crowd is interesting, because when I speak to high schools and colleges, the reaction is, big deal, I send that many IMs every day. For all of us, 850,000 emails sounds, what are you, insane? Sending so many emails. First of all, how unwise is that? And second of all, how do you have the time to do that? Unfortunately, I found the time and lacked the wisdom, and I did do it. And in those 850,000 emails, when my career was at an end and the Senate committee was pouring through my emails to find those emails that were boneheaded and that were stupid and that were callous and that were jocular, and certainly those that I regretted, they were able to, out of the 850,000, come up with 50 that were really unfortunate, and I regret them. I should say, though, that I was a very passionate emailer and a passionate person. When I was involved in something, I was intensely involved in it, whatever it was, starting schools, being involved with family affairs, being involved with clients. All of my clients got the same treatment. Even my kids, one of whom is very nice to sit in the back of the room. When I talked about my kids to my wife, if they did something I thought was stupid, I would say to her, what are these morons doing? Now, they pulled out some unfortunate emails that I sent about my clients. I regret them. I'll regret them to the day I die. I can't unring the bell. I wish I could unsend them. I'm sure I'm the only person in the room who ever sent a stupid email, but I can tell you it's something I have to live with and something I do regret.
Well, another thing that came out along the same way, and you point this out about yourself in the book, that part of what made things more difficult at the end, when you were under investigation and ultimately convicted, was sort of the bravado, the swagger, the style that was involved in the whole thing. And one of the things that came up in almost every article that you read about you was this penchant you had for quoting movies, and specifically, and you know which one I'm going to come up with, was the one from Michael Corleone in The Godfather, when he faces down a crooked politician, and you would say this in the office: "Senator, you can have my answer now if you like. My offer is this: nothing."
Yeah,
and that sounds like a bragging kind of thing.
Yeah,
where does the arrogance come from?
Well, first of all, certainly in that world, unfortunately, I was arrogant. There's no question that, and pride cometh before the fall, and arrogance certainly is something that destroys people, and it did me. No question about it. I think one can source each of the problems that I had to an arrogance, either that I thought I should be winning, or that we shouldn't possibly take a defeat, or that I would take aggressive steps, things didn't apply to me, etc. I just want to correct the movie thing, if I can, a little bit to you, because it was exacerbated by the film that was made with Kevin Spacey. I did quote entertainment, but it was generally Seinfeld. Somehow this did not get picked up. Once in a blue moon, I would quote a movie. I never quoted Red Scorpion. Bobby Zito, who's here, is the wife of the director of Red Scorpion. But as I was quoted in the Spacey movie, the fact is, the folks who worked with me were big Seinfeld buffs, and we usually quoted Seinfeld all day. Unfortunately for me, as my scandal took its toll, and my brother, who's here, will remember this, the only way to really get through something like this is to keep your sense of humor, to somehow try to not become morose. There were many men in prison that I was with who were so utterly and completely depressed and lost any capacity to laugh at their difficulties. Obviously, the Jewish people, has, thank God, had an ability to smile in the face of adversity. But even in the probably one of the worst days of my life, where I was actually in California with my daughter, and I talk about it in the book, where I was indicted unexpectedly in this case in Florida and required to go into the LA County Metropolitan Detention Center, or whatever it's called, and then finally brought, and by the way, I was here on a trip where I was trying to set up the next stage of my life, which is I was trying to go back into the movie business. And so I had had some very successful meetings on the movie side, and then all of a sudden, just out of the blue, in the middle of a meeting, I got called and said, you're being indicted, you have to turn yourself in, you have to hand your daughter over to my brother, who was kind enough to take her and put her on an airplane. Just a horrific circumstance. I was taken in there, put in a cell, stripped of everything, and brought into court in shackles and a jumpsuit. And all of this is going on. Bail is set. I get out. I get in the car with my brother, and I said to my brother, I hadn't seen him, by the way, and we worked on the movies together, and I hadn't had a chance to see him since my meetings on the movies. And I said, first words out of my mouth, Bob, I had some really good meetings on the movie, like that. And he looked at me and said, are you out of your mind? I said, this is a great Seinfeld scene. If you remember when Kramer was in prison in Los Angeles and comes out to Jerry. So, you know, in the course of my business dealings, and I think this isn't just true of me, I think this is probably true of people in general, you tend to relate what you're doing to things that are funny, that people share. It's a way to enhance your activities with each other and relationships. And lobbying is really about relationships. Lobbying is about becoming socially adept with each other. And so with the people who work with me, I would share quotes from Seinfeld. I rarely shared movie quotes. I wish I frankly were as sapient on all the movie quotes I've been accredited with, but maybe one day I can study that.
So wait, so this didn't happen, or this is just unusual? Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
it may have happened. I don't say it never happened, but what happened continually, and I guess it was, what I found in the reporting of my case was things that I did that were normal, just normal activities that people would do, were always kind of skewed a little bit in the reporting. I'll give you an example. I played high school football. And in high school football, at least when I played, one of the goals was to hit the people on the other team. Okay? If you were dressed up in a uniform and a helmet and they were on the other side, you would hit them. And I was a lineman, and so my job was to hit somebody. Well, in the middle of my scandal, the LA Times saw fit to write an article about showing what kind of nefarious, skullduggerous villain I was, that they discovered that in high school, I actually hit somebody on the football field, and I knocked them down. And they wrote a whole article on the front page of the paper about this. So that just, you know, the level that things rose to was a little much. It's not, by the way, I'm not at all trying to palliate or mitigate my guilt. I was guilty. I did cross the line. I did things that were wrong. I'm sure we'll get into them. But one has to, I think, keep a perspective, and one has to look at things with accuracy. And what happened with me is because I didn't have an opportunity really, or take the opportunity to speak, when this started happening and the media started in on me, frankly, I didn't know what was going to happen. And I made a decision not to speak, and perhaps we'll discuss some of that in a bit. But having done that, what I did was leave myself open for people to just write whatever they wanted about me. Some of the papers in Louisiana actually blamed me for Hurricane Katrina. Now, I was a good lobbyist, but I wasn't that good a lobbyist, all right? And I actually got blamed. What they said was that I had the money removed from the levees that were supposed to go to the levees there and given to my Indian tribe, which of course was not true. And so it just went on and on and on.
Let's turn back the clock, sort of go back to not the beginning, but the beginning of your career as a lobbyist. It's not the usual thing for an American kid to grow up and say, one day I want to be a lobbyist, and I assume you didn't either. What did you grow up thinking you were going to do?
I thought I wanted to go into law, basically. I think if, you know, most kids don't, at least I didn't, sit around and plan out exactly what they want to do. They have some basic ideas. Are they scientists? Are they more in the arts? Are they more interested in law, history, business, that kind of thing? So my interest was going toward the law.
Now, you were raised primarily here in LA, correct? Mm-hmm. And your parents, I understand, well, let me put it this way, you were not raised, you were not born to the conservative cloth in terms of your political leanings.
No, I think
correct?
I was. I think I was.
Your parents were Republicans.
Well, my dad's here, yes. By the time, it's like a bad Woody Allen movie, right? Anyway, see, I quoted a movie. Yeah, no, I think by the time I was born, my father and mother had become Republicans. I think they were probably Democrats early in their life. I was a Republican in the womb. Okay, well. Ergo, the problems that later resulted. No,
the reason I ask you is because in the book you sort of talk about a conversion, first of all, to Orthodox Judaism,
right,
and then also to conservative politics, and it implies that you said that something about the 60s and watching things on TV and the way that you perceived what was going on in the 60s
Yeah, I think
revolted
that
you.
helped inform my views. But the House, certainly I grew up in a Republican conservative House. Possibly my politics took on a more radical twinge because of my experiences at Brandeis, seeing kids, students, posing as pro-Trotskyite, pro-Maoist.
When were you in Brandeis? What
At
years?
77 through 81. And some of them claimed to be Stalinists. I mean, Stalinists, so that kind of activated me, I think. But in terms of my views, certainly growing up in the House I grew up in, seeing what I saw on TV in the 60s, the images that were indwelled in my mind, they led me to be more conservative.
So let me ask you about that, really having nothing to do with what happened later on, just your own opinion. As someone who is a conservative Republican, does it surprise you that Jews, until now, are still overwhelmingly Democrats, at least in terms of how they vote? 78% for Obama, Kerry, Gore, Clinton, all of them, 77, 78%.
Does it surprise me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's certainly the precedent that's been set the entirety of my life, basically, so it doesn't surprise me. I guess it disappoints me a little in the sense that I think there's a knee-jerk reaction in the Jewish community to supporting Democrats, and I think that a lot of Jews have an incorrect opinion of conservatives, Republicans, religious Christians, and things like that. That's what I've encountered. But, unfortunately, I think a lot of Jews don't vote primarily in behalf of what should be their concern with Israel. But that's not new. I mean, this is something that I've seen my whole life. I think probably all of us have.
You expect it to change?
I don't know. I think during the 80s when I was active politically, we always thought the next election Jews would be all of a sudden Republican. They never were. So I don't know. I don't know that it's actually, at the end of the day, how important it's going to be in the American landscape, the American electoral landscape. Because the truth is, most Jews vote in New York and California and New York are no longer competitive states politically. I think the Jews, I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago that the Jews in Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, not Illinois, I don't think Illinois will be competitive this year, but Colorado will probably have possibly a determining impact on the election. A shift in merely 5 to 10% of the Jewish vote in any one of those states could actually move the state. So I think that that's probably where the Jewish vote is interesting from a psephologist's point of view, but from a point of view of general American sociology and political science, I don't know that it's actually, unfortunately, I don't think Jews are as relevant, by the way, as ironically Mormons are. I had Mormons who worked for me, and they told me that early on the church divided the families, said half of you are Democrats and half of you are Republicans, and go out and multiply. And that's why you wind up with Harry Reid and people like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It seems like your real political involvement began all the way back at Brandeis with the college Republicans, and that eventually you wound up being elected the national chair of the college Republicans. The sense that I got from your book is that when you took it over, it was kind of a sleepy organization. Is that correct?
Yeah, they were a little.
And what did you do that was different?
Well, I guess emblematic of the change, when I took over College Republicans, the poster advertising College Republicans was a picture of an elephant sitting in a martini glass. And it said, come to the best party in town, or something like that. And the branch of the party that I was active in was the conservative branch. The other branch of the party at that point was called the country club branch, and that to us was emblematic of that branch. So we got rid of that poster, and being good radical college kids, we came up with the Join the Revolution, Join College Republicans. And what we did was we refocused College Republicans on issues, not on party affiliation identification, on issues. In those days, of course, the Soviets were still extant and marching around the world, so they provided us with some fodder for recruitment, and we focused on those issues and recruited kids accordingly.
Now, one of the people who knew you at that time was Rich Bond.
Right.
I guess he was the former chair of the National Republican
Executive Director.
Executive Director. Not a supporter, I suppose, but
Well,
he said that
it was true then and true now.
He said that he was not surprised by your rapid rise. I guess there's a compliment in there somewhere,
Sure.
and not by your rapid fall.
Yeah.
And he said that he banished you from the GOP, but the damning part is that he said because you couldn't be trusted. Why would he say something like that?
Well, I think he probably said it because he mistook me for another fellow. What they banished was the young Republicans, headed by a guy named David, gosh, I can't think of his name right now, but the young Republican Federation was banished. We stayed there. We didn't get along. Rich Baum was from the Bush wing of the party. I was from the conservative wing of the party. We made no...
Bush meaning Bush 1.
Bush 1, yes. And in those days, the Bush and Reagan people fought considerably. And I was a Reagan person. And so we didn't like them, they didn't like us. Bond and I, we didn't necessarily get along. He did give me some trinkets to give to King Juan Carlos in Spain on a trip I was on. That was the only nice thing he did for me. I think I gave him half of them back, the ones that weren't confiscated. So that was the only nice thing.
So basically, he remembered that he didn't like you. He just got confused about
kicking me out.
What he did to you. Got it.
I think he probably would have liked to have kicked me out.
Right.
I mean, but you know, in those days, college Republicans, we were interested in conservative ideas. We were interested in recruiting people to be active in the party. We did not think that the country club set was interesting to young people. It wasn't interesting to us. It wasn't some reason that we got involved. And these people wanted us to be dutiful little well-behaved children. And we viewed ourselves as having a mission, a job. And by the way, the fruits of our efforts were training several 100,000 young people, many of whom became congressmen, one of whom is still running for president, Senator Santorum, so don't blame me for that. I didn't recruit him. Filling the party with all of the activists that ultimately ran for office at every level. Additionally, in 1984, in the face of the usual program heaped at Reagan all over the place, Reagan won the youth vote. So I think our methods at the end of the day were successful in terms of those. They didn't necessarily like our demeanor in the sense that we weren't truckling, you know, to the party leaders, but that's what happens. Now, politics is interesting because people get to pay you back years later. You can imagine the delight I had in reading not just Rich Bond's comments, but others who, over the years, we crossed swords with. One of the beauties of Washington is the ability to be interviewed by the Washington Post or others and talk about somebody you don't like. And so you'll do a backhanded compliment and then you'll try to slice them up as well as you can. That's part of the game, unfortunately.
In those same articles, there was an allegation, I don't know if it's an allegation, in fact, you tell me, that I think it was part of your college Republican work, that there was support for the apartheid government in South Africa. Is that true or not true?
That wasn't college Republicans, and it was completely untrue. In fact, the opposite was true. I headed an organization called the International Freedom Foundation. I was approached, I was already sort of out of politics into movie making by then, but I was approached from some of the anti-Soviet students from Europe, including in South Africa, who were the liberal kind of South African political party folks on the left wing of what was then called the National Party. I think it's probably still called the National Party. And they wanted to form an organization that was anti-Soviet, and they wanted me to chair it. And I said, look, I'm trying to move on to a different career, but I'll do it, you know, if it will help. The premise of the organization was pro-freedom, International Freedom Foundation. The organization, at those days, this is 1985, 86, in those days, Reagan was president. The people who were protesting outside the South African embassy were Jesse Jackson, Eleanor Holmes Norton, sort of the political opposition of the Republicans. The Republicans and Democrats were divided on what to do about South Africa. Not about apartheid, but what to do about South Africa. I frankly wasn't engaged in the discussion. I wasn't involved with it at all, except to note that this group said we are going to come out against apartheid, fine, and for the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. Now today we all think, well, of course, but in those days when they did that and I said fine, I got attacked by conservative groups. I was brought into a meeting of one of the defense coalition groups and absolutely dressed down. How could I be doing this? How could I be involved in this? I said, listen, I mean, I think at this point it's absurd for them to keep him there, except I tried to defend myself, but I was attacked vociferously. Finished my term with the organization, left the organization. I had met during the course of the time I was involved the liberal Jewish community, by the way, in South Africa, who was funding, I was told, the organization. Years later, after I had left, an accusation was made that either after I had left or during the time I was there, that they had accepted in South Africa money from the government of South Africa. I had no knowledge of that, and I told the press at the time I didn't have any idea. I mean, if I had known that, I would have left the organization. I wasn't in favor of political organizations receiving government funding, period. And so how certainly could I have accepted it there? And so that was my response. Later, when I was now a lobbyist and working hard to defend the Marianas, actually in the very context of the discussion we had earlier, this was brought up in the papers in Seattle. And they unfairly and inaccurately not only didn't credit me with the organization's actual stands, but accused the organization of being pro-apartheid. And they also accused me of representing a man by the name of Mobutu, who was the then dictator of what was known as Zaire and is now known as Congo. Well, normally in law firms, you don't get to respond with letters to the editor to attacks. I told Preston Gates that if I couldn't respond to this, I was quitting that day, because I didn't want it recorded that I was leading a pro-apartheid organization, which was absolutely abhorrent. And they agreed, and I wrote a letter, and it got published. Later, when my career ended and I was being dragged through the mud, this was brought up again. I didn't respond at that time to any accusation, let alone this, but I've since, anytime it's come up, tried to remind people of the actual history, all of which is up on the web as well.
After College Republicans, after the IFF, was that the one? Then you had the stint as a movie producer, correct? But then you transitioned into becoming a lobbyist. So how did that come about?
Well, I stayed involved politically. We stayed in Maryland. We live in Maryland, and we stayed there. And I stayed active, raising money for friends. And then in 1994, the Republicans won the Congress. The first time in my lifetime that they had both houses of the Congress. So I was approached actually at synagogue the next, that Shabbos right after the election. My synagogue, I go to an Orthodox synagogue. The synagogue I went to then was primarily comprised of government workers. So
Is that Kemp Mill?
No, this is Woodside.
Woodside.
And in Silver Spring. Now, you don't find a lot of Orthodox Jewish synagogues that aren't politically right-wing. They're usually Orthodox Jews are usually Republicans. But this synagogue I was at, because they were all work for the government, everybody was pretty much on the other side. So I remember the Shabbos I was introduced at the synagogue. We have a new member, Jack Abramoff, works for the Republican National Committee. And I actually heard sissing, like that, so I thought that was a little strange. Anyway, one of the other members was a Republican too. And he was my across the street neighbor. And he was managing partner of a law firm called Preston Gates. I knew he was a lawyer, but frankly, I didn't know much what he did.
They're based in Seattle, is that correct?
They're based in Seattle. They're no longer known as Preston Gates. They're known as K.L. Gates or something like that. But Gates is Bill Gates' father. Preston died like 300 years ago or something, but Gates is Gates' father. And after Scholl, Jonathan, the blank, who was the individual, came up to me and he said, we were congratulating each other as the only two Republicans in the building on the election. And he said, I understand, or I told him actually, I said, Jonathan, somebody actually approached me to become a lobbyist. And he said, oh, really? Why don't you come join our firm as a lobbyist? I said, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to be a lobbyist? Because in my mind, lobbyists were kind of right down under their, under car salesmen. No offense to any car salesman here, of course, to compare you to a lobbyist, a horrible thing. But I said I didn't understand why you'd want me to be a lobbyist. He said, well, these Republicans who took over the Congress are not the normal Republicans. Now, in the lobbying world, the normal Republicans are moderate Republicans, and they were all conservative. And I knew all these guys, and he knew that. He said, I'd like you to come take a look at our firm. And he said, primarily what we do is keep the government off Microsoft's back.
But the firm was not particularly Republican.
No, not at all. Not at all. None of them are. Or none of them were. There are a few now. And so I came in to meet with him and met with the various folks. And notwithstanding the fact that one of the senior guys in one of the meetings told me that he had seen Red Scorpion, the movie that we made, in the movie theater. And I said, it's funny, I thought I met everybody who saw Red Scorpion in the movie theater. I still joined the firm. And I joined it. I think what made my decision I write about in the book was I went meeting to meeting to meeting, and they had a few Republicans there, but they weren't folks who knew kind of the guys who were in charge now. And the final meeting was with a man who was in his 70s at that time, named Lloyd Meads. And Lloyd Meads was a former Democratic member of Congress who, very liberal from Seattle. And I came in there, and I was told he's very liberal, and, you know, I said, all right. So I sat down, and he asked me, he said, you know, Jack, if we had a client that had something you disagreed with, would you work, how could you put yourself in a position to work for that client? I said, well, you know, to be honest with you, I can't. He said, what do you mean you can't? I said, I can't do something I disagree with. He said, well, what if it was a very important client to us? I said, sorry, I can't do it. He said, well, what if it meant your job here? I said, well, then I guess I'm not getting a job here. I figured that was it. And he thrust his hand and he goes, I've been waiting for somebody on the right to be like I am. He said, that's the way I am. He said, now, we might not agree on anything. Turns out we wound up agreeing on lots of things. But that was the thing that convinced me to actually be a lobbyist and join that firm.
I just want to pick up on your earlier comment. So were you implying that most of the lobbying firms are more Democratic affiliated?
When I became a lobbyist, yeah.
Is that still the case?
They're much more balanced now. See, when I became a lobbyist,
and it was I'm sorry, because I want to understand this. Balance means
Republican and Democrat.
within the same firm.
Yeah.
So it's not. Are there firms that are clearly identified one way?
Yes. Yes. There are usually smaller firms. Mm-hmm. The bigger firms in lobbying, the top firms have to be both, mm-hmm. because you can't, if you're not able to speak both to Republicans and Democrats in Washington, you can't get a bill stopped or started or anything like that. Or you have to be paired with another firm, meaning that your revenue is going to probably be a lot less. So at that time, there was no need for people to hire Republicans because, frankly, the Republicans had never taken control of the House of Representatives. Now, just to understand the lobbying world, whoever controls the House completely controls the House. So you almost never need to lobby somebody in the minority party in the Congress, in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, however, unless somebody has more than 60 votes, even at 60 votes, when the Democrats had 60 votes, you can't completely control the body. So both the Republicans and Democrats are important. But in the Senate, the Republican moderates were always more important. There were very few actual real conservatives like a Jesse Helms or people like that in the Senate up until that time.
All right. One of the things that I found very helpful, and I guess it was towards the latter half of your book, you described in trying to get your reader to understand why companies choose to hire a lobbyist. Mm-hmm. You gave many, many examples up to that point of your own particular involvement, but you created a hypothetical. I don't know if it's fair because you wrote the book, but I'm going to assume that you remember this part, where you talked about a picture frame manufacturer, mm-hmm. and you talked about that all of a sudden, and maybe you can pick up the thread of the story as a way of explaining why someone might legitimately go and seek lobbying help.
Yeah, I gave an example of, I was trying to identify what is the problem, because frankly, most America is upset at Congress, upset at the political system. Congress has ratings of basically under 10% approval. I mentioned before that Congress is less popular with America than Saddam Hussein was with people who killed him, okay? So there's a problem here, and so the question is, what's the problem? Why are people, so upset? And I tried to distill it in this example. And the example I gave was as follows. Let's say you live somewhere, and I gave the example of the Midwest, and you had a company, a family company that you've had for generations, and you made picture frames. And you were very proud of your picture frames, and you had a bunch of employees who worked for you, and you turned out really the finest picture frames. And we're taxpayers and good citizens and good for the community and good ecologically and everything. But all of a sudden, a senator from New England goes to the store and buys a picture frame, and he pounds it on the wall, and it falls, and it breaks, and it cuts his foot. And he gets upset. He doesn't like that because senators are very imperious and very, supercilious people also at times, but they're certainly arrogant, one would have to say, but not all of them, but let's just say this one was. And he decided that, I don't like this. I think there need to be new rules for the picture frame industry. and he calls up a staffer and he says, you know, I bought this picture frame, it fell apart, we need to put together federal rules on picture frames, so there's a Uniform Picture Frame Act. And they come up with the Omnibus Picture Frame Act. And you're sitting in Kansas, and you have no idea about this, but all of a sudden a friend of a friend of a friend hears about this, reads a little article in the paper, and calls you and says, hey, you know, your picture frame business might be in trouble here. And you hear about this. What are you supposed to do at that point? This bill, if it goes through, is going to make obsolete your entire company. It's going to kill everything you do because you don't make picture frames like they want you to make picture frames. So you have a choice. Number one, you either go out and just ignore it and say, I'm going to make the picture frames any way I want, and the hell with them. And that works real well until they come to arrest you and kick your door down and take you away in violation of the Picture Frame Act and give you your sentence. All right, that's choice number one. Choice number two is you basically close the company. You bring everybody in and say, hey kids, I'm sorry, I was going to give you the company like my grandfather gave his son, and I gave to, you know, I was going to give to you. That's over with. We're closing the company. Number three is you try to do something about it. So what do? Do you move to Washington so you can meet all the 435 congressmen and 100 senators and maybe convince them about picture frames? Or do you hire a lobbyist? You hire a lobbyist. You're not going to move to Washington, and you're not going to even be able to have the time to meet them. They're going to pass the bill before you have a chance. Now you have to hire a lobbyist. Who are you going to hire? You're going to hire the lobbyist who's the expert. He's a really fine person, and he's out there, you know, basically studying picture frames all day, and he knows where the nail goes in and this screw and how much torque and all that. And he'll be able to describe every detail of picture frame construction with anybody who wants to hear it. Or are you going to hire the lobbyist who plays golf with the senator every Saturday? You're going to hire the golfer. And the golfer's going to go on the golf course, and on the third fairway is going to turn to the center and go, hey, Sam, what's this picture frame business? Oh, my foot got cut. Come on, we'll hold a fundraiser for you, don't worry about it. All right, end of bill. Okay? Now, who's at fault there? Are you at fault? Are you wrong to save your company? No. Why are you at fault? Is the senator wrong? Yes. The senator's abusing his power. That's what goes on in Washington, abuse of power. How about the lobbyist? Is the lobbyist wrong? How do we view the lobbyist? We view the lobbyist negatively, generally, in America. We don't like the lobbyist. He's sort of the middleman. But sometimes the lobbyist is necessary. What I believe, and what I've been actually, since my book came out, and since frankly I got out of prison, I've been trying to work to do, is to take the money out of the lobbying. Take the ability of the lobbyist to unlevel the playing field so that the other lobbyist who might know something about the picture frame might actually have a shot to go in there and talk about it. Or, by the way, maybe the owner of the company may have a shot to go in and talk about it. There are many times when I could get meetings with senators and congressmen, or my staff could, but I knew their constituents couldn't. And I knew that there was a problem in a bill, I could get in there and take care of it, but they couldn't. Now, in those days, I didn't view that as a problem. I viewed that as that's the way business is done. I'm going to be better than anybody else at this. So in golf courses, I used to take people to play golf. You know how I took people to play golf? I put them in a Gulf Stream and fly them to St. Andrews. That's how I took people to play golf.
St. Andrews in Scotland.
Scotland. All right. When I took people would take people to dinner, I had 2 restaurants. People would take people to sporting events. I spent $1.5 million a year on sports tickets. So I didn't have any lack of resources to play in that game. That's a problem, though, that somebody could do that.
But you're saying that you did what everybody else did, you just did it better.
Well, I went over lines. All right, I went over the line. They're actually, believe it or not, they're actually lines. All right, they're ridiculous. You can be completely contemptible and corrupt within the law in Washington. All right, and most 99% of what I did was 100% legal. That's the problem in Washington, that's legal. That it's legal, for example, you're not allowed to buy a congressman a meal, okay? If you're a congressman and I'm a lobbyist, let's go out and have a meal, sit down and have a $25 hamburger. Can't do that, okay? But if I say, you know what, we're not gonna have a meal, we're gonna have a fundraising event. It's just gonna be the 2 of us, we're gonna have that same hamburger, and oh, by the way, here's $5,000 contribution. That's legal. Okay?
A lot of hamburgers.
Sorry?
A lot of hamburgers.
That's a lot of hamburgers, right. So Wimpy would be very happy, but not the rest of the country.
Well, you also said that, and this is a quote from you, some use the government to get a competitive advantage Forcing your competition to be over-regulated is an age-old method of getting a leg up in a business. Are you telling me this goes on all the time?
Yes.
And initiated by whom? Initiated
By
by,
companies?
by
Well-
legislators, by lobbyists, by companies?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Can you give us a specific example?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to think of an area. Well, I'll give you an example I was involved in. I represented a company called Tyco. Now, Tyco had an infamous CEO by the name of Dennis Kozlowski. Okay? This is before I represented them. And he went to prison. I think he's actually still either in prison or just getting out of prison in New York, in state prison. And Tyco had this reputation as a consequence of being a corrupt company. The truth is they weren't a corrupt company. There were things that were corrupt going on in the executive office, but they're a combination of about 350 defense and security companies. Now, I represented them. They hired me to undo a retroactive tax that was going to be applied to them to the tune of about $4 billion. So they hired me to undo that, and I did. In the course of that, I was called by a friend who was at the General Services Administration, and he'd said, Jack, we're about to put a debarment order on Tyco at GSA because they're corrupt. And he shouldn't have told me about it, by the way. It was inappropriate, and unfortunately, he's in prison today. All right? I mean, I'm sorry to say. Nice guy, but, unfortunately, he's in prison.
I'm sorry, he was in prison. That was part of the unraveling of this whole deal, or that was separate? His imprisonment was
His imprisonment had to do with specifically about a trip that we took together.
But it was part of the overall investigation?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And so he told me about this. So I immediately, of course, alerted my client, and we worked with them to show them that this was not the case, that they were not corrupt, that they were certainly not still corrupt, and that all of the allegations that were put out against them within GSA, General Services Administration, and ultimately the Defense Department, where their contracts lie, were inaccurate. It didn't take me another 2 days to find out that the people who had done this were their competitors. All right? Their competitors basically rounded up a package of old clips and accusations, and their lobbyists went in there and basically through Congress got this put into GSA and moved this debarment along to the point where the letter had been signed. It hadn't been issued. If it had been issued, their stock would have, of course, plummeted. I was able to catch it before it was issued, and we stopped it. But this was done by lobbyists who were attacking them. There are hundreds of examples every year of this. People are not idiots in Washington. They get it. They understand that the government can hurt you and the government can help you. Unfortunately, it's very much of a two-edged sword. And lobbyists understand better than anybody how to play defense and how to play offense. Offense is generally more difficult, but offense for a company could be extraordinarily lucrative if you can take your competitor and tie them up. Another example of how to tie a competitor up, very briefly, is to get some friendly congressman or senator to call a hearing where all of a sudden this company is called as part of a hearing. I've been active in behalf of the Stock Act. The Stock Act, by the way, is a legislation that is supposed to impede members of Congress from trading on insider information legally. Okay, I know this sounds absurd that they can do that, but in fact, they could. Now, what I was saying in my press interviews about the Stock Act was that it's great, it's just not enough. They need to, frankly, force them to put their assets into a blind trust while they're members of Congress and staff on Capitol Hill, because it's not just that they get information about securities, about companies, and can trade it. They can cause stock to move. And I've seen them not necessarily purposely do it, but when they call a hearing and about a company, the stock can plummet. So anyway, that's an example of how they can be offensive.
You also said it's common practice to use nonprofit organizations as a way to camouflage money that's really going to lobbying efforts.
Right.
Can you give an example of that one?
Well, I mean, it was something I did continually. You see it in everything. The pharma companies, the pharmaceutical companies during the healthcare debate used a plethora of nonprofit 501c3 and 501c4 organizations to go out there and in essence, lobby. C4s can lobby.
So in theory, these are educational or
Well,
or
educational
health-
C3, but C4 is a lobbying group, but
Right.
it's not, it's a nonprofit. It's not the actual client or company. And there are loopholes in the law for how to do that legally, where you can contribute money as a group and no one has to report it. The reporting laws are really silly. I'll give you an example. I represented a group of internet gambling companies, okay? In 2000, I represented the state lotteries.
That's the e-lottery or is it?
That was e-lottery in 2000. There was an effort to make internet gambling illegal. They wanted to do lottery, internet lottery sales. You imagine what the Powerball would have been or whatever it's called if they had it on the internet. It would have been $1 trillion. But they wanted to do that. They wanted to preserve their capacity to move toward that. So they hired me and I was able to help defeat that business. Now, in 2003, the congressman who, named Goodlatte from Virginia, who was the main proponent of barring internet gambling, came back with another bill. E-lottery was no longer a real player, so I was hired by a group of party poker, poker pals, poker this, poker that, a bunch of overseas-based internet gambling companies who wanted to fight the bill. And they didn't want to be revealed. We didn't necessarily want to be out there lobbying for party poker, which doesn't sound so good. And so there's a provision in the law that if not more than 20% of your client group is any one individual entity, you don't have to report any of them. So all we did was get 6 of them and divide it up equally. And those kind of loopholes, which are absurd, of course, are replete throughout the system.
Now, when you started the Capital Athletic Foundation, and later you were accused of funneling that money into some of your charities, was that true or not true?
Well, the Capital Athletic Foundation was funded to be a charity.
No, but I mean into Eshkol Academy, Jewish charity, things that
Right.
have nothing
No,
to do.
the monies that went in there were monies that were due to me. I pled guilty to tax fraud for this, by the way. At a certain level, my wife and I gave away about 80% of the money I made to charity and communal efforts. At a certain point in the tax code, when you hit a certain level of giving, you don't get the one-for-one deduction. So what I was doing, I wasn't doing it to save the money because the money was minuscule, to be honest with you. It was such a small, the tax is such a small percentage. But just out of speed, I was supporting lots of Jewish schools, in particular some schools that were constantly at need of money. I know possibly as your background in Jewish schools, you know that sometimes that's the case, that they needed money. And so I was having clients directly give money to the Capital Athletic Foundation, which was set up originally as the National Institute of Torah, which was basically a funding organization for the schools. I changed it to Capital Athletic Foundation.
You changed the name of it?
I changed it because I intended to, and I was in the process of changing how the money was being given to the schools. And I wanted to turn that foundation into something that bothered me was the way that kids in athletics were taunting each other and were bad sports and things like that. And so Capital Athletic was being reoriented to deal with bad sportsmanship among student athletes. But I didn't get a chance to do that because
Right,
I was.
but you can understand when the money goes from something with that name to a yeshiva, doesn't look good.
Well, it didn't look good to the press,
Yeah.
of course. I mean, but I didn't expect, and this is one of my failures, unfortunately, I didn't expect, everybody was involved in the chain of the process, understood what was going on. I didn't expect to have to defend it in the press, and that, unfortunately, I guess I should have.
Now, so much of your work really revolved around Congress, much more than the executive branch,
Right.
and you really were involved in Congress. I watched, of course, the 60 Minutes, and the reporter, I don't remember who she was, but
Leslie Stahl.
she asked you how many legislators did you have as your people
Right.
at any given time. You remember what you responded to her, the number?
Probably 100.
You said 100.
Yeah.
And when then she asked you, wasn't that a lot? And you said all you could think about was, why don't I have the other 335?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, let me explain that if I can. A big lobbying firm, 100, any big lobbying firm in Washington has at least 100 members of Congress who they can go to at any time for almost anything. I also, what got limited, she interviewed me for 8 hours, and obviously it was a 15-minute segment or something like that. I said that it wasn't merely 100 members of Congress that we had significant influence with, it was at least 300 that we had a lot of influence with. meaning we raised money for them, we were involved with their offices, something
You
like that.
touched them in some way.
Yeah.
Yet you criticize them. I mean, you don't have a high opinion of congressmen. I mean, you said that you consider them mostly to be lazy, and that when you want to get something done, you have to go to the staffers.
Right. Is that inconsistent with?
Well, I'm only asking you. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, congressmen view themselves, I think, for the most part, and there are exceptions, and I talk about some of them in the book, they view themselves as kind of chairman of the board, and they have a staff. You know, in the old days, Daniel Webster was a congressman. You know how many staffers he had? 0. He wrote all his own letters, and he answered all his mail. He wrote his own legislation. He wrote his own speeches. Today, if you find a congressman who's writing their own letters and their own speeches, other than Dana Rohrabacher from Orange County, then I'd be shocked to hear who this is. They have a bunch of staff. The staff, like any big organization, the staff run the show. If you want to get something done in a studio, you want to get a meeting with a studio boss, you're going to go to their PA. You're going to go to their staffer to get that meeting. Same thing in Wall Street. You know, you're going to wind up with lots of staff kind of managing the day of the congressman, especially a congressman. They have constituents coming in all the time. They have speeches to give. So the staff are vitally important. I recognized that early on. I didn't, the context of the remarks that you quoted were probably in the sense of hiring congressmen. I didn't like to hire them as lobbyists because, frankly, they felt this sense of entitlement. They were used to having a staff of 20, 40 people at their beck and call. People who worked for me were basically raisers 24/6. You know, they were on call to do work. Congressmen weren't inclined to do that.
you said that the staff, that a good way to control a congressional office was to imply very clearly to the chief of staff that there would be a job for him and her when they, or her when they finished. Is that correct?
Right. What I found was 90% of the people I wound up lobbying wanted to work for me, wanted to become lobbyists. And the reason is obvious. The money of a lobbyist is making 3, 4, 5 times as much just out the door than somebody working on Capitol Hill. So there was constant interest. When I first started my practice, and you know, I didn't have any clients right after I joined Preston Gates. Right after that, I started building the practice, getting clients, and had to hire people. When I first hired the folks on Capitol Hill, I had to hire them immediately. I didn't have time for them to really even wait a week. They came immediately. But after I built the practice, I started choosing people I wanted to hire, primarily chiefs of staff. And I found that if I made an arrangement to hire somebody, and they would come a year later, let's say I wanted to hire you and you say I can't come for a year, I noticed that during that year, all you thought about was me and coming to work for me and my firm and my clients. And it turned out that these folks wound up being better staffers for me than they did for the Congress. They would call me if there was a problem on Capitol Hill. They would call me if they thought of something for my client. So they turned out to be incredibly geared to my clients. And so I identified that in my book, as I tried in my book to identify the corruption that people don't actually think about up there. That's one of them. And I give in the book, I don't know if we'll get to it or not, but prescriptions for these various ills that are affecting the system. And one of them is that the revolving door between public service and cashing in has got to be shuttered, has got to be stopped. And so that's just one of the areas.
Did any of these staffers go as far as copying you on emails that they sent to their own bosses while they were working for them?
Copying me on email? Probably. I don't remember, but probably.
Okay. It was in the Washington Post article that they did about you, so that's why I'm asking.
Well, there's one thing they got right, so that's good.
Okay. You were identified pretty closely with Tom DeLay, who eventually became the House Majority Leader.
Majority Leader.
Majority Leader, I'm
Right.
sorry. Majority Leader. And did you do fundraisers for him?
Yeah,
A lot of them?
as many as I could.
Was your relationship purely political? Was it political and personal?
Political and personal.
Okay. You tell an interesting story about an encounter that DeLay had with the Microsoft folks in 1995, where they were coming to ask, well, actually, they were coming to ask for a favor, basically.
Right.
And why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, DeLay, like, frankly, many members of Congress over the time I was there, some of them were subtle about wanting money. Some of them were not subtle. The Microsoft people in 1995, they were not political yet. They thought that they'd just stay away from Washington. I think a lot of the high-tech people had it in their mind that somehow Washington wouldn't bother them, they could just do what they want. because it was the internet and things like that. Well, they tried to buy Quicken, if you remember back then, and they were thwarted by the government, by the Clinton administration. Now, Microsoft was primarily a company that was very liberal and very Democrat-leaning. And so we were their lobbyists. We were their lobbyists before I got there. Preston Gates did all their work. And they all of a sudden started realizing that the Republicans were the only ones who were standing up for them. So they wanted to meet the main hammer, as he was known, among the Republicans, Tom DeLay. So I took the two of the very senior Microsoft people in to see DeLay. And DeLay wanted them to give money to the National Republican Congressional Committee. And that's not unusual. He was trying to get everybody to give money because they wanted to keep the Congress. So we sat there, and DeLay, there were two executives. One was a very senior man, a very fine fellow who had come from Procter & Gamble and had a little more government experience. And then one was a younger woman who was there, who was, I think, their head of government relations. And she was a little bit more naive, let's just say, in terms of how Washington works. And DeLay said, you know, it's very important that we stay in power. It's not only important to us, frankly, it's important to you, because the people who want to take over the Commerce Committee, if the Democrats take the Congress back, want to basically break you apart. These Democrats want to break you apart. That's what they're probably talking about. We are totally against that. We are for you running your business as you think you should run your business. So we need to stay in power. You need to help us stay in power. I'd like you to help us, if you would consider it, to make a contribution.
How did they respond?
Well, she responded by saying, well, we don't really want to get involved in that part of politics. So DeLay said, well, let me tell you a little story. He said, when I was a freshman congressman in Houston, he was from Houston, Texas, I went to the Walmart representative, the government Walmart fella, and I needed to raise money. I just won my seat. I needed to get reelected, and I wanted them to give me some money to keep me in office. And I went to him, and the guy said, you know, we don't sully our hands in that kind of thing. I said, okay, and I left. And a few months later, in comes this fella to say, you know, Mr. DeLay, we have a store in your district. He said, yes, I know you do. He said, and we'd like to get an exit from the freeway where our store is, from the federal freeway. And he said, yeah, I bet you do. He said, now we'd like you to be the one to sponsor that bill. He said, you know what? I don't want to sully my hands with this. All right? So DeLay told that story to the Microsoft people. They had their jaws open, and they understood the story, and they contributed money to the NRCC.
All right.
He used to tell me he was dating the head of government relations at a tribe in Mississippi. And he used to tell me about her, and we were always in touch. And one day he calls me and said, Jack, you remember that tribe in Mississippi? I said, yeah, I do. This is 1995. He said, well, they have a problem and they need a lobbyist, and I know you're a lobbyist now, and would you be willing to help? I said, sure, let's get on the phone. So I got on the phone with them, and they told me that the Republicans had passed a tax increase, or were about to, a tax increase just on Indian tribes in the 1995 Budget Reconciliation Act. And it was a little strange because the Republicans ran on not raising taxes and not raising anybody's taxes. So I said, I'll look into it and let me see what I can come up with. And I did. I figured out what was going on. I got my old buddy Grover Norquist, who was heading Americans for Tax Reform, involved, and we put together a big effort and beat that tax. That's how I started with them. That's how I started.
And then others began to come to you because
well,
of your
actually,
success.
for a long time, I never took another tribal client. I just stayed with the Choctaws, and we would do work on behalf of all of Indian country at their behest. So if, for example, Senator McCain attacked what was called the Indian Child Welfare Act, and so they set me on McCain to make sure that that didn't happen, and they'd help. We'd go help smaller tribes and things like that. For a while, it was just Choctaw. Then eventually they asked us to go represent some others too.
Others as well. But of course, when things began to fall apart, that was sort of the core of the accusation.
Right.
Was that you had been overbilling them,
Right.
you had been misrepresenting them. And in particular, they came in apparently to, Greenberg, Traurig, you pronounce it, and all these emails, we're back to emails again, and what happens when you put things in email. And one of the emails was an email between you and Sean, I don't know if I pronounced the name, Vassal, is that that's his name? It says, in which you instructed him to, quote, pump up the hours of the other lobbyists in order to justify a $150,000 monthly minimum. And he had said to you, Jack, I can't figure more than 2 hours this month for you. And you said, just pump it up and
Right.
had to make sure we get to the 150.
Let me explain that. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Most of my clients paid a flat fee. Now, this is going to get into a little bit of law firm economics, how law firms account for time. At normal lobbying shops, you don't have to bill your hourly time. At law firms, you do. And I'm sure all of you have probably had lawyers and you get these bills with, 1/10 of an hour or 2/10 of an hour or some silly thing in the bill. Associates at a law firm, their salaries, and some partners, are set by how many hours they bill to clients that pay. I had mostly clients that paid flat fees, so it didn't matter how many hours people worked on it or how many hours people didn't work on it. So what we tried to do is to, when our lobbyists worked on clients where there was no pay, it was something we did pro bono, it was something we did on behalf of the Choctaws for some other tribe, we would put that time under a client that's paying a flat fee. Didn't mean any more money for the client. It was an internal way for the law firm to account for the time. The law firms always encouraged it because they wanted their associates to be compensated for work they did. Usually at law firms, though, work that you do in business development or in pro bono, you can't be compensated because there's nobody paying for it. I had an exception, so that was part A of that. Part B, let me finish.
Okay.
Part B, the main client I had, the Choctaws, they did not want to do a flat fee. Their government structure was such that they couldn't do flat fees. When I started with the Choctaws, the first few months was $40,000 a month. Now, where that was is approximately, what we did was we took the amount of people in the firm who worked on the client, the amount of hours they worked, times their hourly billable rates. And that's how you come up with what the monthly bill is. First few months when we were just working the tax thing was $40,000 a month. Eventually, the Choctaws handed me their entire portfolio. And there were months when the hourly bills got up to $200,000 and $300,000 a month. We had that many people working that many hours at that many rates. I, early on with this client, said, as far as I'm concerned, it's fine. Obviously, we're making a lot of money, but I know that this is being very disruptive to your planning. The head of the government was the head of planning, too. I said, what do you want to do? So we decided that we would have a target of around $150,000 a month. And on those months during the summer, when we didn't have a lot going on, and we had a low bill, we would add hours for the associates and for the partners to bring their bill toward that mean average. But on those months where we had very high bills, once the bill got up to $600,000 a month, the bill was pared down to around the $150,000 range.
But I guess what I'm not, see, what you're saying is that it was $150,000 a month, whatever that is, times 12 a year. Can't do the math that quickly in my head, but
1.8
million.8, that you were just balancing it out over the course of the months.
Right.
There was no attempt to defraud. There was nothing.
Right. I didn't plead guilty to that.
So there was nothing wrong in that.
Right. Absolutely.
So there was no overcharging of any of the Indian tribes at all.
No. In fact, I at the end added up. I mean, look, this was part of the pile-on scene. I added up at the end that I charged roughly $80+ million in fees over the course of the time I was a lobbyist. We added up the benefit of what we did for our clients, and it came to, not counting that Tyco thing that I mentioned, came to about $6.8 billion. Our clients hired us on a week-by-week basis. I had no deals with my clients saying, hire me for a year. If my client didn't like me, they could have fired me that day. But my clients kept me for 10 years. We were delivering for them. Now, by the way, that was my old world. I'm not in that lobbying world, and I wish I frankly wasn't in that lobbying world. But speaking about what accurately took place in that world, unfortunately, it's not as good a story in the media as you ripped all the poor Indians. You should know, by the way, that when we had a tribal client and we proposed to them to work on an effort, they also had lawyers. We negotiated with lawyers to come up with a price that everybody agreed on, with definable deliverables that everybody agreed on, and then we set to work and at the end got letters from them saying that we delivered. None of that became important to the media. The first Washington Post reporter who came and interviewed me in my office, I put down on the table a big thick binder of all of these achievements. She didn't even open it up, and she wasn't even interested in it. They were interested in a different story. They were interested in a perfect villain, and they got one. Unfortunately, I added to it with a wardrobe malfunction coming out of court one day, but that they got a villain. That is not to say that I did not do wrong. I did do wrong. I did break the law. I went over the line, including with my clients, by the way. Where, though, was I guilty with my clients? What I was guilty of is this. Our clients had efforts in Washington where we lobbied for them, but they also had efforts outside of Washington where they had attacks on their market share in their various states, people trying to put casinos between them and their market, basically. So they came to me, and I organized companies to go and do that effort. What I didn't tell my clients, or I didn't tell some of them formally, was that I was sharing in the profit of those companies. Notwithstanding the fact that I did work on those things, I should have formally told them I'm getting part of the profit.
Now, are you speaking of the work that you did with Mike Scanlon specifically?
Yes, and by not doing that...
So in other words, he was hired at your behest?
Yes.
You got them to hire him?
Yes.
And then he was splitting fees with you?
Yes, and I was doing half the work with him, but I didn't formally inform my clients. Some of them knew, but I didn't.
You didn't inform them why?
I frankly didn't inform them that I was making money from the law firm either. I mean, I assumed that I'm working on this, that would be okay. It was wrong of me, by the way, and I've suffered for it, and I pleaded guilty to fraud. That was fraud when the accusation came. And that's not to say they wouldn't have done it anyway. They probably would have done it. They probably would have signed on. I didn't have the right to take away from them that decision, but I did do that. And that's as far as my clients goes, that's what I pleaded guilty to.
During your time as a lobbyist, obviously you were, how can I say, playing with the big boys, certainly on Capitol Hill. And you were acquainted with certainly some of the major legislators of that time, some of whom are still around. So I want to feed back to you some of the comments that you made about some of them in the book and, and sort of see where you stand with this. On the very first page of your book, it's an interesting choice of how to begin the book, but you talk about appearing before the congressional hearing. That was a good dramatic entrance. I give you, from a literary point of view, I give you high marks there. But you had some very unflattering things to say about Senator John Kane. You referred to him as being, quote, the one senator most responsible for this day of reckoning, and, quote, his usual sanctimonious preening self, the embodiment of everything I loathed in a politician. Pretty strong words.
Yeah, I had to tone it down for the book, but yeah.
Now, you were his political opponent. You kind of bragged at one point in the book about helping to make sure that in South Carolina, George Bush got the nod for the nomination, and as we all know, that led then to the White House. So probably not surprising, and there were some other things that you talked about in the book, other reasons he had for not loving you. What are your reasons for not loving him?
Well, I didn't like his ties, number one. No, I'm kidding. He was, McCain, well, I should say this. I want to just in the last few days, we've started a rapprochement. Okay, he's made some positive comments about me in the press, and I'm trying to make positive comments. So my old view of McCain, let's just say, we came from two different parts of the party. We were at constant clash on ideology. McCain was the one Republican who could always be relied upon to co-sponsor with Teddy Kennedy and Feingold and everybody else liberal legislation. As a conservative in the party, I disdained that and felt it was very destructive. But he wasn't the only one. The reason he was the target of my wrath and other conservatives was he was extremely difficult to deal with. I give an example in the book. When I went in to see him about the Indian Child Welfare Act, there was an extreme arrogance, and I'm not saying I wasn't arrogant, I was, and I admit it in the book, and I'm ashamed of the fact that I was. But he had this senatorial arrogance disease, probably an unrecoverable dose. And so the combination of his acerbic personality, what I thought were incredible hypocrisies surrounding his activities, his ideology, and the fact that his coterie of lobbyists who were his supporters were also genuinely and generally my competition and aggressive competition seeking to glean my clients away from our vineyard. All of that kind of added up to him not being my senator of the year, any year.
Let's move on to Ralph Reed.
Yeah.
You guys met really early on. I mean, all the way back, I guess, in college or right after college.
Right after
college. As you all know, he was the former head of the Christian Coalition. And I assume you're a friend for a long period of time. But you quote him as saying, this is what he said about himself, Ralph Reed: "I want to be invisible. I do guerrilla warfare. I paint my face and travel at night, and you don't know it's over until you're in a body bag." Now, what does he think about you now? You put that in your book.
Well, I don't know. I hope I won't wind up in a body bag, but you know, Ralph and I parted ways, and
Apparently.
yeah. I guess what I was unhappy with in our relationship was, you know, a lot of people had something to say publicly who were involved in my life, and a few of them got up and just plain out lied, and especially at a time when I was frankly on the ground bleeding, and Ralph was one of them. And I felt it was inappropriate. He wound up suffering for it because he wound up actually costing him the lieutenant governor's race in Georgia. But I felt it inappropriate, and I thought that that's not probably the kind of person I'm going to be close to.
So he got the quote. Not inaccurate.
Well, he said it. I mean,
I know, I understand it's not inaccurate, but it's a
I
truth.
report. Look, I love Tom DeLay, but I reported. I
Right.
tried in my book to report what happened and what people said. And sometimes people who, you know, I love are unhappy, and sometimes people I don't like are happy in the book. But that's not the metric I use to,
All right, so
write this
speaking of
book.
people who are certainly unhappy, let's go on to Newt Gingrich.
Okay. Excuse me.
I think there was one half a line that could be construed as being complimentary in the
Really, I thought they took that out.
in the book.
Okay.
But just an example, when you talk about your first encounter with him,
Yeah.
I don't remember what the subject was, but when you said was about Newt, you said, as soon as he heard an issue, he would quickly decide what to do, even without the benefit of all the information. And that was the end of the discussion.
Right.
I assume you don't think he's presidential material.
Not this country. No.
All right? But he was the architect of the 1994 Republican Revolution.
Right.
You know, you kind of came in on that, at least in
Look,
terms
I mean,
of...
there are many architects of revolutions who are not necessarily appropriate to be the head of state.
Okay. I know that your writing this book was part of what we refer to in the trade as the tshuva process, the process of repentance. But it raises the issue, and I think you can understand that. People are wondering, you know, is it real? Is it not real? How do we know if it's real? In one of, I don't think it was in the book, but it's somewhere else, you talked about how Maimonides saw repentance, which, as we know, is you have to be in exactly the same position as you were before, but this time you don't do it. Well, you're probably not going to be in the same position, so that part we may never know. And then you have people, I don't know if you remember the review that R. Jeffrey Smith wrote about your book in the Washington Post. So this is what he said. He said that your efforts or atonement are, he said they're undercut by the pride with which he recounts his lobbying victories. You think that's unfair?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you may not know that R. Jeffrey Smith was one of the main reporters at the Post working on my case, and was actually accused, even by their ombudsman, of doing things that were a little untoward in terms of my case. But putting that aside, I write about what happened. I try to put myself back into the emotional and psychological state of what happened when it happened. I give a running commentary, though, as to my view of these things now. But for me to use a dolorous and mournful, lugubrious approach to those days, as if I kind of trudged through it and regret it, it would be dishonest. I wanted to convey honesty in the book. I wanted to talk about what things were. I was portrayed as the perfect villain, that everything I did was wrong. The media even attacked my charitable giving. They somehow turned my giving to Jewish education into some sort of part of a nefarious plan. And indeed, and I'm not certain you saw this, but there was a movie with Kevin Spacey in it.
I did.
And there he delineates playing me, my grand master plan. And what does my plan consist of? Having big clients and having big political efforts and putting people into power. Oh, and a Hebrew school. What does that mean? A Hebrew school? What? And the last time I checked, it's not part of any master plan to have a Hebrew school.
But I think what he was talking about, and I understand a little bit better now, but when you read the book, I mean, one of the things that comes across sometimes is it does sound like there's a lot of pride in achievement.
Well, I was
to
certainly happy with things that I did where I could apply resources in a way that were helpful or good. I certainly was happy about that. You know, I don't think it's, I get this sometimes that people say to me, well, how do we know you mean it? How do we know you're repentful? Number one, I was in prison for 43 months. Number two, I lost all that I had. Number three, my family suffered immensely. Number four, you can't judge what's in my heart. You don't know what's in my heart. Okay, so as far as my response to you, am I really regretful? The answer is yes. If you won't believe me, I can't really do much about that. What you've got to do is look at what I do. And that's the only way you can judge people, including in halakha and Jewish law. We don't necessarily judge people's hearts because we're not God. We can't see that heart. So in terms of what I'm doing, I'm spending my full time now not only working to make restitution in terms of those who are victims in my case, not only going and speaking about what I did honestly and talking about the things that I was involved in and how unfortunate they were, but also in trying to change the system. Now, if all those things, and along with all the suffering that we've been through as a family and I've been through personally, are not enough for somebody, then there's not much more I can say.
Yeah, I don't think, and I certainly am not applying that. I think what he's trying to indicate is that when in a book, and I understand what you're saying now, that you're characterizing it as capturing the enthusiasm of the moment rather than saying that now when you look back on it, but the Imelda Marcus story, we don't have time to go into all of these stories, but there seems to be a little bit of pride in the cleverness, in other words, in them being able to figure. Now maybe that's not a bad thing, but it does come out, and I think when someone wants to interpret it negatively, it does give them something.
Indeed, that fellow
right,
was
it
one
does,
who did.
It does give them a basis.
People are going to be able to interpret everything anybody does negatively if they want. I've sort of stopped caring about that, to be honest with you. After my unfortunate mug was on the front page of the paper enough times in Washington, I stopped caring what they wrote. You become calloused and sort of hardened to it.
Thick and skin.
Yeah.
Okay. And the same thing, by the way, with the charities, when you talked about having a charitable addiction. Again, that sounds a little bit like, I gave away all the money, and I'm not suggesting you were trying to mitigate it, but it does sound every so often in the book sometimes like, well, I did it, but I did give away a huge amount of
Well,
this
I think
money.
in that case, I'm glad you raised that. What I was trying to do there in the cases where I discussed that, and I try to do also, people will say to me, well, didn't you know you were off course? How come you didn't realize what you were doing then is something you now look back upon and say, gee, I shouldn't have been doing it. And I say that part of the reason I didn't, part of the reason was, first of all, the kind of banality of evil scenario where the environment, the milieu was of a certain ilk. But second of all, I was making a lot of money for clients who were fighting the good fight, succeeding for them, making them a lot of money, and making a lot of money for myself, and then giving away 80% of this money. So I was convincing myself with each step that I was not only not a Rasha, not somebody evil, but in fact a tzaddik, somebody who was doing righteous and good things. And that helped to impede my capacity to analyze properly that I was in fact off course.
So it got in the way to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
Just a couple more questions, then we'll go to questions from the floor. I did watch the movie Casino Jack. I felt it was appropriate for, I can't say that I saw it when it came out, but I did watch for this movie. And for those of you who saw it, there's a scene when Jack, you, or Kevin Spacey being you, is sitting in the witness table, and he's already been told that he consistently must take the fifth on every single question. And earlier, a couple minutes earlier in the movie, he had fought against it, didn't want to do it, but finally understood that that was the way that he had to go. And then while he's taking the fifth and fifth and fifth and finally come to one question, and without our realizing it in the movie, we're now moved into a fantasy scene when all of a sudden Jack says, no, I'm not going to take the fifth, and he stands up and he looks at every single one of the accusers, which were all congressmen who are sitting on this panel, and one by one talks about each one of them and the contributions that they took. Now, you didn't actually do that in real life. But
right.
The question is, to what extent would you have liked to do that?
Oh, nice softball question. 100% I wanted to do it. I was watching senators who, including the chairman of the committee, who spent a good deal of time smashing my head in there, who the only memory I could vividly recall of our interactions were sitting at a breakfast meeting where I handed him bunches of checks, and he told me unsolicited chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee, that none of our tribes would ever have a problem with his committee. Okay, and I wanted very much to say, well, Senator Campbell, when you say I'm corrupt, is this what you mean? All right, but that only happens in the movies. If you do it there, they have a little jail cell in the Capitol, and that's where you go. They declare you in contempt of the Senate, and they drag you out. Now, you know, we think of Senate hearings as if they're courtrooms, as if you have the same rights. You have none of the same rights in a Senate hearing. Senate hearings, unfortunately, can be kangaroo courts, and that's what mine was to be. I was told that they had, and I write about it in the book, they were going to take every tax return I ever filed, every paper they could get their hands on, and they were going to keep me there for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, 8 hours a day, grilling me if I answered the first question. So they knew I wasn't going to answer the question, but they decided they would just keep going anyway, which is what they did. Just to prove it to ourselves, my lawyer at the beginning, I had a superb lawyer, Abby Lowell, and Abby at the beginning of the hearing says, "Senators, I'd like to ask a point of information." And they said, yes. They said, "You have a rule in the Senate that you made that is if a witness is likely, the testimony of a witness is likely to result in a criminal indictment or in their reputation being impugned," and nobody, by the way, was more likely to wind up with an indictment or impugning a reputation than I, that the rule in the Senate is that the hearing must be closed to the public and conducted in private session. So we'd like to assert that the likelihood of both of these is extremely strong, and therefore we'd like a closed session. They looked at each other, they kind of laughed, and they just kept going. So, you know, we knew that would be the case. And so I didn't get a chance to talk. I wish I did. Because when I came back from that hearing to my restaurant, and I pled the fifth, you know, in America, unfortunately, when you plead the fifth, the only message that is I'm guilty, right? That's what people think. And by the way, I'm not any different. That's what I always thought. You're guilty. And everything they said, I said, I'm sorry, I have to assert my rights under the Fifth Amendment, actually Fifth and First Amendment, and one other amendment, I forgot what, that I asserted. And I came back to my restaurant on Capitol Hill, and I forgot who it was. A friend of mine came up and said, "Jack, what are you doing?" I said, "What do you mean, what am I doing?" He says, "I saw it on TV. It was carried live on TV." He said, you pled the fifth. What are you doing? You should have answered the question." I said, "Should have answered the questions." I said, "Do you know what the result, I used to run hearings like this. Do you know what they're for? To get you to somehow perjure yourself so that they can draw criminal charges against you. That's it." And at that point in my life, I didn't yet realize I had already crossed the line and broken the law, and I was going to prison. If I had known that, as I look back, there's no question in the world I would have gone in there and let them have it. And I'll tell you what, I got a letter, and I wrote about this in the book, from Senator Grassley. Senator Grassley was then chairman of the Finance Committee in the Senate. And this is in the midst of the the Senate Indian Affairs Committee with all the Sturm und Drang they were working up about me. And he said, "We'd like to hold hearings about you. We want you to submit the following 700 documents, and we're going to plan for a hearing in the Finance Committee." And my lawyers, I had run out of money by then, and my lawyers, God bless them, were working and continuing to help me, as they do to this day, without having been paid. And you can imagine how thrilled they were. A hearing, an average cost of a hearing where you answer the questions to a target is about $1 million to prepare for a Senate hearing. It's average is $1 million. Now, it might have been a little less for me, but probably not. So my lawyers said, "You know, Senator Grassley just sent us this letter. We're going to have a hearing in the Finance Committee." I said, "No, we're not." They said, "Yeah, we are." I said, "No, we're not. There's not going to be a hearing in the Finance Committee." They said, "Well, why not?" I said, "I'll tell you why not. We got the letter from Senator Grassley's committee staff. They wrote that letter. He signed it. If he saw it, he'd probably use the auto pen. His political people, at some point, are going to hear about this letter. And they're going to say, wait a minute, you can't bring Abramoff in. He flew Senator Grassley in his plane all over the country and did fundraisers for him. He used to have a room at his restaurant that was Senator Grassley's room. He used to have a box at the Redskins Stadium that Senator Grassley used all the time. You can't do that." I said, "They're going to have that conversation, and we will never hear from them again." And in fact, that's what happened. Because the chance that I didn't take the fifth for them, even if
was
they
too
got
much
me,
of a
it was
risk.
too much. It would have
Too
been the
much of
end
a
of his
risk.
career.
Last question. You know, you lived a life so close to the sources of power in this country. You had entree almost everywhere, almost into every office, whether they remember meeting you or not. But you had entree into almost every office, and it's hard. I mean, it's hard to live that life and then to have that life taken away, even with an interval of prison in between. So, when you think about your life now, what lies ahead? I mean, relatively young. You're younger than I am, so you're a relatively young man. So what goes on now?
Well, look, I take every day as it comes, and I'm grateful for everything. And I want to say something that I've told to my children continually, notwithstanding everything that happened that was horrible. And some of these were pretty bad. Some of these days were pretty horrible. At no point in any of this, including when I was in solitary confinement in the prison, 90% of the world would trade places with me, okay? Even in the worst of it, 90% of the world is living something much worse. So we have to be grateful for what we have, and I'm very grateful for what I have. I have a father who's here, a new stepmother who's here, a brother, and a lovely family, and I have a wife who is amazing, and kids, one of whom is somewhere in the back studying his, oh, here he is. Where? Okay. Anyway, oh, there he is, sorry. Studying his mathematics. And so I couldn't be more grateful. I couldn't be more lucky. Now, I've gotten some tough knocks, but you know what? Is there somebody in the room who hasn't gotten tough knocks? Everybody gets to have their peckle, as we say in life, right? Their difficulties. You know, when I was in prison, I had visitors every weekend. I was there for 185 weekends. And I had a lot of visitors, and my wife came every weekend. My kids came many weekends. My father and brother came as well, and my sister. But I had a very interesting visitor who was a Hasidic rabbi, a friend of mine from New York. He's a fascinating fellow. He's used to be an ice hockey coach, and he used to write the biographies, autobiographies. He used to write the autobiographies for NHL hockey players who probably couldn't write. And so he would write their biographies, and he was a magnificent fellow and big into sports with his long black coat and his payas and his beard and his hat. And he came, he sat there in prison, and he looked at me and said, you know, Jack, God doesn't throw fastballs at hitters who can't hit him. And I know this stinks, all right, but there's nothing he's going to give you that you can't take. And you have to realize where you're at and where you're going. In our religion, it's not where you came from necessarily, it's what are you doing next. And what I'm hoping I'm doing next is something positive and something good, something that is in some way able to make a difference, in some way to make recompense for some of the things I did in the past. And that's my hope, and I pray to God that I can get there.
All right, let me open it up for questions. Please. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the 90% that haven't got as good as you do. I would say 99% is what you brought about, as Greg Polish wrote in his book, The Best Congress That Money Can Buy. And you were the one who were the facilitator in making sure that that money went.
Excuse me, do you have a question, or you don't have a question? We're only doing questions, not speeches. So if you have a question, please.
That wasn't a speech. That was
Okay.
just putting in context.
There's a lot of
My
context there.
question to you
Okay.
is, how can you really see the difference between you and a high-class who would do anything for
All right, but all right, I'm gonna, you don't have to answer that. That's not a question. Does anyone have a question, a real question? Yes, right here on the second row.
The charge that upon which you were indicted, the name of the charge.
I was indicted under three things, or I pled to three things. I actually wound up pleading before I was indicted. I pled to fraud, I pled to what's called honest services fraud, and I pled to tax fraud.
Yes, please, sir.
I do have a question, and that is, you were caught and you were punished. What happened to the people, the beneficiaries of your largesse?
Well, one of them went to prison, a congressman from Ohio named Bob Ney. And Bob Ney went to prison primarily because Bob Ney, separate from me, took $50,000 in casino chips from an Iranian gentleman who wanted to sell planes from the U.S. to Iran. And Bob wound up taking that, cashing them in, and paying off his mortgage somehow. Anyway, they dressed his indictment up with my stuff as well. But none of the others who were involved were indicted or pled in terms of the congressman. And one of the reasons is, and it's one of the things that is a great difficulty for law enforcement, and I should note, by the way, I spend my time now speaking not only to schools and other places, but without being paid, I speak to the FBI training programs and the Justice Department training programs about public corruption, about the issues I was involved in. And they have something called, which we're all familiar with, I'm sure, the speech and debate clause, right? Speech and debate clause is what separates the executive branch from being able to come into the Congress and punish them for something they said in the Congress, in theory. It's in the Constitution. However, its application by the courts is such that whatever they do in Congress can't be touched. So, for example, you're familiar, I'm sure, with Congressman William Jefferson, who had $90,000 of cash in his freezer, and he's sitting in prison today. If that freezer were in his office and not his house, he would be enjoying the money today. That's the problem. That's why they can't ultimately go get a lot of these congressmen.
Just to clarify, Tom DeLay's problems didn't have anything to do with his relation with you, correct?
Right, in Texas, right.
All right, because he's still pending, I think it's on appeal, right, his conviction?
Yes,
Is that correct?
right.
Please, gentlemen, yes.
Yes, so you talked a lot about the lobbying Congress. You make a little comment about the lobbying that goes on with the executive and the executive branch and what you're feeling.
Oh, sure. Can I comment about it? Is that what you said?
The executive branch.
Yeah, lobbying does go on. I mean, we see it with, in the current administration, the one that came very public is the Solyndra loan, where they gave them $500 million in loans, on the verge of bankruptcy. It does go on. We didn't do it as much. We usually found ourselves at contretemps with the administrations, and we felt that we could achieve more with the Congress. They're much more malleable. I'm just going to speak honestly with you. They were more malleable in Congress than the administration. Administration also has better rules prohibiting gifts than the Congress currently does. That doesn't mean that people don't lobby them, and unfortunately, every administration tends to reward its donors and people who are close to it with special favors.
In the back?
Yes, hi, Jack. As I understand what you're saying, lobbyists raise money for people who are running for office, and that money then winds up going to community organizers. Is there a difference between a community, the invectives that generally are ascribed to lobbyists and those that should be ascribed also to the community organizers? Or is there some special relationship that should otherwise give the community organizer a free pass?
I'm not sure who these community organizers are. Do you understand the question?
I think I have an idea of which community organizer he has in mind, but well, I think that just the terminology is lobbyist, community organizer. Community organizer is a positive, good thing, and lobbyist is, someone seen trolling around in the dirt. It depends on what they do. There are many good, look, most lobbyists are fine people, and they're not breaking the law. By the way, virtually none of the lobbyists break the law. They don't have to break the law. But most of them, I would say, go beyond the law and don't actually engage in the kind of skullduggerous activity that I was involved in. And there are many community organizers who I'm sure are very good people too, and probably some others who are not.
Questions? Yes, sir, in the middle.
I always had thought when I was growing up that the government was working in my best behalf, that they were my friend. Now I feel increasingly that I am estranged. I think that they are not acting in my best behalf. There's a lot of incestuous relationships going on in Washington, D.C. that we are totally powerless to do anything about. What can you do? What can the average individual or a group of average individuals do to correct a situation which is not right?
Well, I think that part of the problem in America now is that the federal government has grown in a way that it's sort of usurped things that were normally locally dealt with. When you're dealing with local government, at least let's just say in the old days maybe, you felt a little more satisfaction because the likelihood that they were members of your community, they knew the real needs, was much greater than some distant bureaucrat. However, as the government expanded and continues to expand and take under the federal purview so many things that are important in our lives, we feel distant from them. The reversal of that is the major debate in the country. What is the role of the federal government? How big should it be? How many things should be controlled by it? And there are people all over the map who have different views. Conservatives might view that certain aspects of the government should be bigger, and liberals might view that other aspects should be bigger, but at the end of the day, they're both bigger, and they wind up having more control. And so as a result, we are very frustrated with what goes on. Let me give one prescription in terms of the frustration with the corruption, and perhaps that's even some of the frustration this gentleman had, in terms of the capacities of special interests and their lobbyists to come and to untilt the playing field and come in and get those goodies and those benefits that all the rest of us can't. So in my book, I prescribed what I thought would be real reforms. Reform is a joke in Washington. Washington reform is basically something like this. We can't have lobbyists buy congressmen meals. So what we'll do is we'll define a meal differently. So a meal is no longer where you sit down, or a meal is where you sit down. But if the congressman stands up, that's not a meal. So and literally, this is true. Or my favorite one is, if the congressman eats the meal with a knife and fork, that's a meal. But if they use their hands, that's not a meal. Well, I don't know. They must not have eaten with a lot of congressmen, these people, because at the end of the day, the etiquette was probably not there. But those are faux reforms. They're not real reforms. They're reforms, frankly, that lobbyists want people to think are reforms, and that therefore we cleaned up the system. But there's so many loopholes in the system. You don't only not have to be a genius to find the loopholes, you have to be an idiot not to find the loopholes in the system. So what I did was, as I was in prison, by the time I got to prison, I realized, I was wrong. I shouldn't have done what I did. I shouldn't have been involved necessarily in the system, but I went over those lines. I had my own 100% guilty me. But then there's the system itself, and I started rethinking the system that I played so well. I played so well. It was probably I had the top book of business in lobbying in Washington, and I was probably one of the most powerful Republican lobbyists that were there. And so I started rethinking that and thought, this isn't good for the country. This isn't good for anybody. But when I got to prison, my attitude was, all right, let me do my time in prison and then just go hide somewhere and just go away. Because I've had it with this. Whoever said there's no such thing as bad press, they didn't see my press, okay? It was all bad. It was terrible. It was nightmarish. My wife stopped reading the newspaper in 2004, February 2004. My wife has not read a newspaper since then because of this. My wife has not seen a news broadcast since then, okay? That's how bad it was for us. So I decided, though, when I was in prison, I could just go away. I could just restart my career and could go out there and do what I'm going to do to make money. But the fact is, I know a lot of stuff. I was in a lot of rooms that nobody's been in. I've been behind the doors that everybody wonders what's going on. And I also know what hurts, because I know what I would have tried to stop as a lobbyist if it was proposed as reform. And so as I circled the walking track in prison day after day, I started thinking about what would real reform look like. And I wrote it up. And I came out, and I started to meet with all of the good government groups, all of the public affairs groups that are out there, public citizen, citizens responsible ethics in Washington, and citizens for the Republic, all the rest of these groups. I started meeting with them all and saying, listen, I know you attacked me. I was your biggest boogeyman. But guess what? I've changed my side. I'm on your side. But now let's have a discussion, because I think there's a reason you always lose. Every time you go to get reform, you lose. Who do you lose to? Me. And people like me. Why? Because you don't know how to fight. You fight like do-gooders. You need to fight like lobbyists. You need to realize the war you're in. And so you need to realize how to legally use the tools that are out there to change the law. Now, what should the law changes be? And they're always out for these sort of pavid kind of minuscule changes that don't mean anything because they think that's all they can get. I said what we should do is, number one, ban any money from a lobbyist to a public servant. And by the way, a lobbyist needs to be defined what a lobbyist is. Newt Gingrich says he wasn't a lobbyist. okay? If Newt Gingrich wasn't a lobbyist, then I was a history professor, all right? He was a lobbyist, all right? Anybody who goes to the lobby is a lobbyist, you know? Anybody who's planning a lobbying campaign is a lobbyist. I only went 5% of the time to Capitol Hill to lobby. I didn't need to go the rest of the time because I planned out better strategies and had other people doing it. So we need to redefine who a lobbyist is. So that redefined lobbyist cannot give any money. The clients of the lobbyist shouldn't be allowed to give any money. People who are trying to buy a result, whether they're a labor union or a corporation or whoever they are, in essence, if you're giving a public servant money and you want something from them, what is that? You know what it is? Say it. It's a bribe. It's a bribe. Unfortunately, I was engaged in that. All right? Now, if that's the case, ban it. Make that the law. Number two, revolving door. You don't like it that members of Congress go there. They're worth $20,000 net worth. They come out worth $20 million. You don't like that? So ban the revolving door. Stop them from doing that. Stop them from people like me taking advantage of the fact that I know I can hire them and they can work for me for a year before they come on board. Stop that. Okay? Number three, I was against this as a lobbyist, as you can imagine. When I describe it to you, you can well imagine. Term limits. When I was a lobbyist, I did everything I could to fight term limits. Why? Once you buy a congressional office, you don't want to have to buy that office again in 6 years. You know, you don't want to necessarily go buy a new car every year. You buy a car and you give it a wax job every year, right? Or you fill up the tank. You maintain it. It's cheaper. It's cheaper to maintain a congressman's office who you've got already. You want all the congressmen to be like Strom Thurmond. Die in there when they're 100 years old. The person taking them out is the undertaker. That's what you want if you're a lobbyist. So I come out in favor of term limits, that they should be. There are plenty of smart Americans. There's not only 535 bright people in this country. There are thousands and thousands. Let them have a chance at it. And finally, and this is so intuitive to anybody, every law they make should be applied to them. Okay? They shouldn't be allowed to legally use insider information to trade stocks or everything else. By the way, it was only recently, historically, that sexual harassment was no longer permitted to them. They were allowed to sexually harass their employees legally. I mean, they had no OSHA rules applied to them. Everything that's applied to us wasn't applied to them. So those four things, I work with United Republic now, which is one of these groups. And they're not like me, they're not conservatives, they're progressives. But we agree on these things. And we're working right now on a very important campaign that's going to be announced probably in May. And the campaign is this. We are having some constitutional scholars draft up legislation for these four items that will survive the courts, the test of Citizens United, okay, and some of the other things in the courts. And we're going to have a bill that's going to very concisely and very appropriately state and codify these changes in the law. Some of them, like the term limits, are going to further have to have a constitutional amendment, but okay, put that aside for a second. And we are going to launch a campaign, borrowed from my friend Grover Norquist, to get members of Congress and their opponents to pledge that within 30 days of the inauguration of any Congress they sit in, they will co-sponsor this bill. They will put their name in the well of the House and co-sponsor it. Number two, they will vote against any amendment to this bill, even technical amendments that will dilute the bill, because that's one of the lobbyist tricks. You just amend it, technical amendment, technical amendment. By the time you're done, who knows what the bill says? Number three, they will vote the bill through every committee process, cloture in the Senate, discharge in the House, every little trick along the way. They will vote for the bill. And finally, that if they don't do that, they will not run for Congress again. And we're going to get members of Congress to sign this, starting Memorial Day. By Labor Day, we're going to have 6 races, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, where they haven't, one party is signed and one party is not signed. And the entirety of this organization and all of these organizations are going to file into those 6 districts and beat those who didn't sign and have the people who did sign win. That is the only thing Congress understands. They don't understand we're going to cut your money off because, frankly, there's plenty of money. If I tell a congressman, I'm going to give you any more money, yeah, big deal. It'd take them 30 seconds to get more money. But if they lose their job, then they're in trouble. So that is something that can be done. And when this happens, and you see this happens publicly, pick up the sword and get involved. That's what you can do.
Do we have time for one more question? All right, you have the last word, sir.
Let me ask you something about the term limits. Some of us here may have heard Russ Feingold talk about that. His defense against term limits was that he says it takes a term or two just to begin to understand the issues. And he used the example of the subcommittee on African affairs. He said, you know, after 6 years, you barely know where the countries are, let alone who the leaders are. And he cited Herman Cain's remarkable interview as an example.
Well, I don't know that Herman Cain should be used as the paradigm of intellectual virtue for members of Congress. Frankly, if we're electing bunches of Herman Cains, we ought to be thinking about it, you know, in general. I hear that. I also hear that it empowers the lobbyists, getting rid of members. Let me tell you something. There's no greater holy water that you can splash on the devil lobbyists than term limits, all right? And that speaks volumes itself. Second of all, I've been in that system deeply. It is utterly incorrect that it takes several terms to figure it out. You can figure it out if you have a brain. You can figure it out within a few weeks, ultimately. Third, if they're doing things that take decades to figure out, they need to stop doing those things. That's not the purpose of our federal government. And so in terms of the response to it, I would say that, first of all, I'm also, by the way, in favor of term limits for staff. Okay, because the staffer that stays there for decades and rules imperiously also needs to be term limited. So, look, if term limits aren't perfect, ideally we elect people who understand, you know, what they're there to do. But you can't exist in that environment. I'll just tell a really quick story before we end. In 1994, at the end of '94, I became a lobbyist. In 1994, the Republicans gained 52 seats in the House of Representatives, and they won the majority. One of those congressmen was a fellow from the South. And he announced proudly that he would never meet with a lobbyist, he would never take a lobbyist's money, he would never take special interest money, he would never take PAC money, he would never let his staff meet with lobbyists, and that's the way he was going to be a congressman. So we immediately said, fine, big deal. There are plenty of other congressmen. You don't need 435 congressmen. You just, frankly, need 20 to 100, and that's it, all right? So we said, forget about it. He was reelected in '96. Same shtick, you know, with I'm not going to take lobbyist money, this money, that money, okay. '98, he gets reelected. '99, I get a call from one of the fellows who worked for me. And mind you, I mentioned that we gave out $1.5 million worth of tickets to sporting events. I had people who worked for me. Their only job was to sort out who was getting tickets to which games. But that many tickets. I had 72 tickets in the Redskins Stadium under our control, all right? Scores of tickets. I get a call from one of my lobbyists who says, this congressman wants to take his son to the basketball game. Now, my basketball tickets included 4 that were like Jack Nicholson type seats right on the court. And Jordan was playing for the Wizards then, okay? So he said he wants to take his son tonight. I said, no, you have this wrong. He doesn't want to take his son. You have the wrong congressman. He says, no, I don't. I just talked to his staff. I said, you talk to his staff? They don't talk to lobbyists. He said, yes, they do. And he'd like to go to the ball game tonight. Are you okay with that? I said, well, I'm taking my son to the ball game tonight. My son Daniel and I are going. He's going to have to sit next to me if that's okay with him. Yeah, that's fine with him. Okay. So I showed up. And he shows up, and his son's there, and our sons are talking, and he leans over and says to me, so Jack, tell me something about your clients. Now that's usually the opening line in a conversation that ends with, by the way, I'm having a fundraising event next week. Okay? And in fact, that's how that conversation ended. And I thought to myself, this is the guy who wouldn't talk to lobbyists. And I realized, and in those days I was happy about it, okay? I realized there's very few, if any of them, that can make it through year after year, term after term. The pressure on them by both the special interests and the lobbyists and by their leadership to raise money is so extreme that frankly, they need to have fresh blood in there constantly, people who come in wanting to do things right, and then they need to leave and go do something else.
Generally, when we have programs here at the university, we don't get emails in advance criticizing us for having programs. However, in this particular case, I did get at least one. Usually, they come to the staff and they protect me. But there are smart people who can figure out what my email address is. And so the question was raised why we wanted to go ahead with the program. And I want to tell you why we wanted to go ahead with the program. There were two reasons. One is, as a Jewish institution, and we touched on this a little bit with the idea of doing tshuva, of trying to repent, that we feel it is our obligation not to make a judgment about a person who is making the attempt to repent. Obviously, we can't read into someone's heart. We don't know, there's no way to measure that. I mentioned how Maimonides has a way of doing it, but he was Maimonides, and we're living in 2011, and it's not likely that 12, thank you. Let's say. So I'm a little bit living in the past, but not 1,000 years. And there's no way that we can know something like that. And so if we're going to err, we'd much rather err on giving someone the benefit of the doubt and helping them in that process along the way. And the other thing is because this is an educational institution. And what was very clear, and became even clearer to me after reading the book, that there is much to be learned from Mr. Abramoff's experience. What you got here in this conversation was just the tip of the iceberg. You got very generalized statements about the kinds of things. And if you really want to understand what goes on in the Congress, and if you really want to understand how your government works, then you have to read a book like this, because only if you read it and you take the time to digest it will you begin to understand and have at least a little bit of a glimpse of an understanding what goes on and how your government actually works. So I would suggest, if you haven't already done so, that you would want to pick up the book and don't just buy it, but actually take a look at it and understand better how your government works. And Mr. Abramoff, thank you for joining us this afternoon.